Hello and welcome back to the Virtual Classroom AP Euro Edition. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. Today's topic, the origins and beginnings of the Cold War. Now, as always, take a quick moment, hit pause on this video, jot down the lecture outline, and pay particular attention to those key terms on your left. Remember, you should be able to identify the who, what, where, when, and why, as well as be able to connect these terms together with previous and future key terms. So with that, let's begin. Now, following the dropping of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, the world enters a brand new phase of world history. And this phase becomes called the Cold War. Now, of course, this is a war not necessarily of direct military combat, though there will be some battles being fought. It is instead a battle of ideologies, a battle of culture, a battle between us versus them. And of course, that us or them depends on which side you're on. There is good and there is evil. But again, those terms are relative based upon which country you live in. And what happens is, following World War II, the world is in shambles. Europe has been devastated and destroyed. And as a result, there's only one real superpower immediately following the war, and that is the United States of America. However, very quickly, due to their communist government and the amount of land acquired after World War II, the Soviet Union is able to emerge as a second superpower. And so these two superpowers will begin this Cold War, this period of prolonged battle for capitalism versus communism, democracy versus communism, this battle between ideologies, cultures, systems of government and economics, which one is supreme in the world. Now, each side has their own point of view. For example, the Soviet Union, they view democracy with great animosity. In fact, of course, and vice versa, democracies hold communism with extreme hostility as well. And there are some good reasons for this. Now, one reason, of course, is if you read the Marx, which many of you have, you will understand that communists believed that they were the evolution of the democratic capitalist system, that workers rose up, they took control of the means of production, and they will create this utopian society based upon, well, everyone is equal, everyone owns everything. Now, we all know that does not happen historically in the Soviet Union, but that is what they believe, at least theoretically, ideologically. Well, then there's other things that led to tremendous extra animosity in the years following World War II. And a lot of it has to do with what happens during the war. So, for instance, number one, Russia is extremely pissed off at the other allied powers, the US and Britain, because they did not open a Western front early enough in World War II. And we discussed that in our previous lecture in World War II. And they instead focused their initial attack in Africa, long before they launched the D-Day invasion. And as a result, that leaves millions of Soviet soldiers to die, bearing the brunt of the Nazi attack in the Eastern Front until the mid-1944. Second, from the Soviet point of view, the US and Great Britain, under both FDR and later Truman, will freeze Russia out of the atomic bomb project. Because again, even though they were allies in the war, the US and Great Britain does not trust Stalin and the Soviet Union, and therefore they were not sharing that technology with them. I mean, the US's greatest fear was what would happen if the communists had the bomb, which of course they will get. Third main thing from their point of view was that the US terminated the Land Lease Act, whereby we were leasing armaments and military supplies to the Allied powers, which we did that for both people, for both the Britain and Soviet Union. However, the United States ended and terminated the Lend-Lease to Russia in May of 1945, but kept giving aid to Britain until 1946. Again, this ticks Stalin off. Also from their point of view, the Soviets sought this buffer zone. They wanted this extra extension of land to separate themselves and create this buffer zone of protection and along the Soviet western border, especially in the nation of Poland. And they wanted to, whereas the other Allied powers wanted a free and autonomous Poland, Stalin wants to seek to expand his territory, again, to expand the idea of communism. And then finally, number 4, the Soviets were trying to expand just their sphere of influence. And so they needed extra territory, and they felt that the democratic capitalist system of the West, i.e., United States and Great Britain, were preventing that expansion. Now, from the US point of view, they were, first of all, ticked off that Stalin was trying to expand his spheres of influence. And if you think about, we talked about during the war, we had the conference between Stalin, Churchill, and FDR, where FDR is trying to convince Stalin to provide free democratic elections in those Eastern Bloc, Eastern European nations, which Stalin agrees to. Then, of course, he reneges on later. And so they see this as being, well, animosity, that Stalin is breaking his word. Second thing from the US point of view was, of course, Churchill's Iron Curtain speech, which you see the border on the map on the screen, where he says an iron curtain has descended upon the continent. And he gives a speech in 1946, which, yes, there's a lot of validity to this. But just like we go back to US history with the Missouri Compromise, whenever you are drawing a figurative line across the country that separates us from them, whenever you separate people by us and them, that creates a superiority-inferiority complex. And it's something, if you remember back to, say, US history, to make a comparison to the very ways in which Brown v. Board of Education was decided. The idea of separate but equal does not actually exist, because this, by splitting people up, creates a natural feelings of superiority and inferiority. In this case, by putting an iron curtain, as Churchill called it, across the continent of Europe, you are creating a superiority-inferiority complex. At least you're creating a competition between the two sides. That's exactly what will come. So number 1 from the US point of view is Stalin expanding spheres of influence into Eastern Europe and, of course, breaking his promise. Number 2, the Iron Curtain idea of separating us from them, superiority, inferiority, competition. And then number 3, the US saw itself as trying to spread democracy. And again, whereas in World War I, the idea is, okay, let's form a League of Nations to prevent all future conflicts. That's kind of where it stopped. And even though that was a big failure, part of this mission in World War II with the creation of the United Nations, yes, to prevent future war, but the United States saw its new mission because there was no retreat to isolationism. The United States was a world power. And as such, they saw their mission to be the quote-unquote arsenal of democracy. They wanted to spread democracy across the nation to show that democracy and capitalism was the best. And so you see this microcosm of this both sides' point of views, of course, right in Germany. And of course, even agreed on before the war ends, but as soon as the war ends, we find out very quickly that Germany has been divided into East and West. And so on the east side of Germany, that is now going to be controlled by the Soviet Union, and the Western Germany will be split between the French, the British, and the United States. And within a few years, the Allied powers will kind of conglomerate them three together. It will become West Germany controlled by, well, democratic capitalism, and East Germany controlled by communism. But then, in one of the oddest forms of microcosm, is this idea is right here in Berlin, which you'll note is firmly within the East German boundaries. The capital city of Berlin is also subdivided into East and West, with East Berlin being controlled by the Soviets and West Berlin being controlled by the Allied powers, which means the Allied powers here in West Berlin are completely surrounded by the Soviets, as if that will not create any future problems. Of course it will. Now, why do they do this? Well, this is very much economically motivated. Germany still had to pay heavy war reparations, especially to the Soviet Union. And what the Soviet Union wanted here was in the form of agricultural and industrial goods. And therefore, the Soviets dominated the east side of Germany, eastern Germany, because they don't want to see a revitalized Germany that could once again pose a threat and maybe focus on World War III. Instead, they want to just extract resources, in this case, agriculture and industry, that will A, benefit their country, B, protect Germany from ever rising again, and C, essentially treat East Germany just like a colony, like an imperial power. Now, of course, 1949, West Germany will become an independent country, and the US, Great Britain, and France will actually give back their zones and give an independence to West Germany to rule themselves. Again, while this is done, say, out of the goodness of their heart, this is not completely altruistic. They want to prove that democratic capitalism will be the best. They want to prove that not communist is the way to go. And they can show this to all of Eastern Europe by saying, see, we're the Allied powers. We gave back West Germany to the people, and yet East Germany is still under a totalitarian dictatorship. Now, in response to this, so West Germany will be controlled by Konrad Adenauer, and East Germany will be established, known as the Democratic Republic of Germany. And because in 1949, Russia realizes they have to do this or risk looking, well, play the fool, looking stupid in this. And so they will also, in theory, give up East Germany to East German autonomy, and they call it the Democratic Republic of Germany. That was anything but democratic or republic, because essentially it was heavily influenced and controlled by Moscow. Now, what about overall? What is this? So that's the microcosm of what's going on here. But on the global, grander scale of things, what this really comes down to is how do the Soviet Union and the United States deal with each other? Remember, the Soviets want to expand their sphere of influence. They want to show that communism is the best. At the same time, though, the United States also wants to prevent the spread of communism and at the same time spread their own version of government, democratic capitalism. And in 1947, the United States pledges to prevent the spread of communism, known originally as the Truman Doctrine, and then expanded thanks to U.S. Ambassador to the Soviet Union, George Kennan. This came through what's called the Long Telegram, in which George Kennan argues that communism is inherently flawed as an economic system. Because again, he's very biased, capitalism is the best. And he argues that Stalin and the Soviets are so paranoid, you can't deal with them directly. It's not logical. They don't deal with logic or facts. They're paranoid of losing their power, and therefore, don't try to deal with them, don't negotiate, don't make a deal. Instead, ignore them. Now, what you also need to do, though, is contain communism where it's at, and once you put a wall around communism, it will eventually die off because it's an inherently flawed economic system. This was the argument and became U.S. national policy for the next 50 years, containment. Which, of course, as we know from history, it always works. Just build a bigger, better, beautiful steel wall and contain the problem. Wait, when has it ever worked? Oh well, we'll see what happens next. And of course, Truman Doctrine begins to this idea of containment. So Truman Doctrine was that we're going to prevent the spread of communism. George Kennan adds to that the policy of containment. And by 1947, the U.S. begins to put their money where their mouth is. It wasn't just about military. Again, this is not a war of boots on the ground per se. Instead, in 1947, the United States pledges money to both Greece and Turkey to prop up their democratic governments, to prevent those governments from falling to communism. Both countries were on the brink of collapse. And the fear was, because the governments were so bankrupt after the war, that these governments would fall to communism. When your traditional democratic capitalist government is unstable, when the economy is failing, people are looking for solutions. And many people were looking at communism as a possible remedy. and the Communist Party was extremely prevalent in almost every country in the world in the post-World War II years. And so to prevent this from happening, the US bails out the governments of Greece and Turkey. In the process, the United States, of course, Truman scares the ever-living crap out of Americans and most of the world, arguing this is all part of containment. And this was a small slice of the pie when you compare it to what happens next. In 1949, George Marshall, now Secretary of State, he sends a massive $13 billion bailout plan for Europe. Now, that's 13 billion with a B. And basically, this is a financial aid package that's designed to help rebuild Europe that's been war-torn, during the World War II years. And theoretically, it's a great thing. We are investing money into Europe. It's going to reap dividends, hopefully, and help rebuild Europe to create stronger economic trading partners for the United States. At least that's the economic side of things. The political side of things, though, the purpose was to prevent the spread of communism into these economically devastated regions. And at the same time, will foster stronger trade between the US and Europe, thus boosting the United States economy. The result of this, which by the way, before I get to the result of it, the US offers this to any European nation, including the Soviet Union and those Eastern Bloc countries, to which the Soviet Union forces them all to say politely, no thank you. Because think about it, if they did accept money from the United States, that would tacitly mean, by the Soviet Union at least, that the Soviets are tacitly accepting that capitalist democracies are a better form of economic political system, because they're able to provide this aid wherein the Soviets at this point cannot. Now, the result of this, well, Western and Central Europe recovered economically extremely well. In fact, it was called the quote-unquote economic miracle, something we'll talk about in our next lecture. The Soviets, however, do refuse. And of course, they also force these Eastern Bloc nations to also refuse. And they see the Marshall Plan as being an economic and political power play by the United States. And of course, it was. Of course it was politically motivated. Of course they want to make the US take it. And so how does the Soviets respond to this? And one of the ways they respond, a myriad of ways besides saying no, they also go one step further and try to remove the Allies from West Berlin by cutting off access to the city. In 1948 into 1949, the Soviets do, in fact, cut off West Berlin from any Western aid. And so what do you do now? The city is firmly located within East Germany, the Soviet Eastern Zone. Stalin orders all roads leading to West Berlin to be blocked by Soviet troops. There's no way in, no way out. And this crisis becomes one of the early and one of the high tension points of the Cold War. And many believed at the time this could lead to World War III. Instead, Truman offers a massive airlift where US organizes this massive airlift, sending 277,000 flights into the city, carrying food, medicine, and other necessary supplies. What they did, they never actually landed the planes. They just flew down low enough to drop them out of the plane and kept right on flying. At its peak, a flight landed every 45 seconds. And the result, it is for almost a year. Continuously for almost a year, these planes began flying into West Germany to drop off supplies. And finally, it proved too much. And after 11 months, the Soviets finally agreed to lift the blockade. But in response to this, we will see a quote-unquote new world order coming about. Because in response to the Berlin crisis, the United States realized, the Western powers realized that there could be a day when World War III is inevitable. And we need to prepare for that. And to provide a collective security for all Western nations against communism, they formed the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, aka NATO. And again, this is founded in direct response to the Berlin Crisis. And it is a collective security organization consisting of all the democracies in Europe, US, and Canada. Again, the express purpose to prevent Soviet expansion in Europe. And the idea, of course, like any good alliance system, was if any of the original 12 member nations were attacked by the Soviets, the other nations would come to its defense. Now, not to be outdone, the Soviets would create their own, known as the Warsaw Pact. And they do this especially after West Germany joins NATO in 1954. So this is created originally in 1949, NATO is. So again, in response to the Berlin Crisis. However, it wasn't until 1955 that the Soviets saw fit to make their own conglomerate group, their own pact, known as the Warsaw Pact. This was done after West Germany joins NATO. And again, it's the same reason. If any of the NATO nations were to attack one of the Eastern European bloc nations, the Soviets would be ready to engage, and of course, this would begin World War III. And of course, we still have this to the present day. And as of now, it's no longer just the original 12 nations. Now we're up to 26 countries, although its mission has been redefined, obviously, since the Cold War is now over for the last 30 years. And then things start getting worse for the United States and for the Ally side of the NATO side of things. Because in 1949, China falls to communism under General Mao Zedong and establishes the People's Republic of China, i.e. Red China. And of course, this was very interesting. This was a long time coming because General Mao Zedong had long been pursuing a communist China, long before World War II. During the Depression of the 30s, he'd been fighting insurgent warfare, trying to overthrow the government. Now, I'm going to give him a little credit here because he is willing during the war to put those differences aside and help China fight against the Japanese. And of course, the United States did as well. However, after the war, he resumes his attack on the government in 1949, successfully overthrows the government. Now, there's more to this story, obviously, but this is a European history course, so we're going to stop that part of the story right now. Instead, the impact of this was a terrible blow to the U.S. policy of containment. You have the world's most populous country now communist. And then things get worse. Because in 1949, the Soviets successfully created their own atomic bomb. And the US no longer had a monopoly on nuclear weapons. And of course, how did they get this knowledge? Well, most of which was through espionage in the United States. And just like we talked about, if you remember last year, when Truman tells Stalin, hey, we got a bomb. Stalin's like, yep, I knew it already, long before you did, actually. And as a result, again, we start questioning our intelligence, we start questioning our security. Again, the blows seem to keep coming to the United States. So we have China falling. Then we have the Soviets creating the atomic bomb. Then in 1950, we begin a new conflict. And again, I always refer to this as the Korean War. I know some want to technically call it the Korean conflict. I think legally it is a conflict as far as legislatively. However, anyone who fought in this will definitely call it a war. So here's some quick background on the Korean War, the Korean conflict. After World War II, to prevent tension, Korea, North and South, was split at the 38th parallel. The North Koreans were communist, the South Koreans were supported by the United States and the United Nations. In 1950, North Korea, supported by Soviet Union, invades South Korea. The United Nations, which were led, of course, by the United States and General Douglas MacArthur, and he sends in forces to push back the communists. Now, the UN Security Council was able to vote for military action against North Korea because the Soviets were boycotting the United Nations at that time. So the Security Council at that time, the Soviets had been boycotting, which gave them the number of votes needed to take action against North Korea. Why were the Soviets boycotting? Well, in protest of the US refusal to allow the People's Republic of China, i.e., Communist China, to be on the Security Council. So you can see this is a very tangled web of political intrigue here. China fell to communism. The Soviets want to support this new communist nation, which they do for a number of years. But because the United Nations would not accept communist China and accept their growing power to put them on the Security Council of the UN, Soviets boycott the UN Security Council. And then when the Soviets helped the North Koreans attack South Korea, the United Nations does not need the Soviet vote to launch a UN-led coalition to push back the North Koreans. Again, I hope you're still with me here. Well, what happens next? Well, China, still ticked off and want to support their neighbors to the south and, of course, communists. They also send in thousands of troops to push back the UN forces back to the border of South Korea. Now, this conflict/war lasts for 3 years. You see the dates on your screen. And at the end of 3 years, we'll reach a ceasefire, and we're going to make a new border, let's say, 38th parallel. So after 3 years, absolutely nothing changed, other than thousands upon tens of thousands of men have lost their lives. So let's see. We had China falling. We had the Korean conflict. We have the Soviets developing the atomic bomb. Let's see. Then things get a little more scary in our world under the Cold War, because in 1952, the United States developed the hydrogen bomb. 1 year later, in 1953, the Soviet Union developed the hydrogen bomb. As you can see on your screen, on the far right, the Russians tested it. The Tsar bomb, as they called it. 50 megaton hydrogen bomb. Compare it to the 15 kiloton bomb that hit Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And now you have a 50 megaton, exponentially increase the destructive power. And now both superpowers have a much more destructive bomb that if you were to launch it and detonate it in the atmosphere, millions would be dead. And of course, things only get worse, because in 1953 through 1955, the US President Dwight D. Eisenhower, along with his Secretary of State, they launched their foreign policy that became known as, quote-unquote, massive retaliation, aka brinkmanship. The idea that we will be much more hardened, much more, hey, let's put our finger on the trigger and see who flinches first, play a game of chicken with hydrogen bombs. And part of this is because Eisenhower, on the good standpoint, he wanted to help those Eastern European nations who wanted their independence. But by doing so, it put us on the brink of a hot war between the United States and the Soviets. And basically, the US vowed to destroy the USSR with nuclear weapons if it tried to expand any further. And the Soviets said, go ahead and try, because we have one too. And both sides were on, quote unquote, the brink of war. Both had the idea of mutually assured destruction, which did prevent anyone from acting too harshly. But that ever-present fear is gripping not only the United States, not only the Soviet Union, but the world. No one is safe at this point. Now, this was kind of the US, Western European side of things. We're going to take a break real quick, come back for part 2 of this lecture, in which we will talk about what's going on in those Eastern Bloc, what is actually going on in the Soviet Union and those Eastern Bloc European nations during this time period. But until then, until next time, hope you all have a great day. Talk to you later.